Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Erwin Seguia is a sports performance coach with education as a physical therapist, a strength and conditioning coach, and he's also a competitive soccer player. He owns an amazing company called Match Fit Performance with Rena. This practice combines facets of strength and conditioning with physical therapy to enable athletes that are injured or healthy to perform at their best. He also works with colleagues to help them develop their own brands and potential future practices by helping them build a solid mental game and foundation which prepares them to enter competitive and niche markets like Match Fit Performance has done in New York City. Through Match Fit Performance, he aims to change the perception of physical therapy from both the outside and the inside. Erwin, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me on today, Ali.
Look, it's great, and you're a refreshing reminder to us that there's hope in this industry, because I've got to tell you, as I wouldn't say I'm an athlete, but I've been injured in my time.
I would disagree with that. You're definitely an athlete. Give yourself some credit.
And I've got to say, it's such a confusing world out there. And then throw on top of that the insurance thing that I don't even want to go down. But here in America, it's slightly crazy. But I guess I want to start by sort of asking you, I know you're a physiotherapist and I know you're a strength and conditioning coach, but to me, you don't seem like the typical physical therapist. And yeah. I don't want to be stereotypical either. So can you explain to me perhaps like how you're different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when it comes down to it and the way that we practice it at Match Fit Performance, it's the foundations that we apply are not technically, we're not breaking any new ground in terms of recovery, but, we try to take a very bird's eye view look, or even what some might call holistic, which is a term I think is really overused in the healthcare industry. But we take a very broad view of the forest for the trees versus the trees in the forest, and looking at not just the biomechanical cause of whatever injury that most athletes come to us in the first place for example, sprained ankles, shoulder pain, back pain. But we'll look at a lot of other external factors that could be contributing to, what they're experiencing. So between looking at their recovery and the subcategories that we look at between their sleep quality, how long they're sleeping, how well they're sleeping, how much they're eating. So the quality of their nutrition, are they eating enough? Are they not eating enough? Which also includes hydration. And then we'll look at physical and emotional stress, which what we're learning now with some of the literature and research in pain science is that unmanaged stress or too much stress can affect the healing and the recovery process. So by taking a look at all of, these three main factors on top of, their ability to train or their training load, there's we have a much more complete picture in this athlete that's looking to return to playing a sport, or somebody that's looking to return to activity at a higher level. So I think that's what makes the difference for us versus a traditional physical therapist, is that we're able to look at all of these things as opposed to just focusing on the biomechanical issue, which most traditional physical therapists are handcuffed basically because they don't have enough time to address these issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when should one go and see a physiotherapist? Because I feel like so often I see a friend and they're like, oh, I'm not working out these days because I've got a sore foot or I've got a sore finger. Or I'm like, but what about the rest of your body? Is that all feeling okay? Is there anything you could do as a workaround? How are you rehabbing it? And there seems to be a bit of mentality out there too of like, once something's damaged, it can't get back to full to full health. And, so I had shoulder surgery, so I don't have
Right.
mobility in that shoulder. I'm like, well, I had shoulder surgery as well, and I do have mobility in that shoulder. So I guess there's so much to talk about here, but when should you go and see a physiotherapist / strength conditioning coach?
So that's a great question. And that's a question that we deal with daily because, we'll get athletes and individuals that'll reach out to us and even friends and family. They're like, oh, I'm hurt. Like, should I go see a physical therapist? And in most cases, the answer is yes. The reason is, I think 100% of physical therapists are very, very capable of being able to diagnose and look at musculoskeletal injuries, and potentially our education prepares us to assess other systems and make sure that we can refer out appropriately. So going through when I got my doctorate of physical therapy, we got a ton of education on, okay, well, is this something that falls within our scope as a musculoskeletal injury? Absolutely. Is it not? Well, then who's the right person that I can refer to? And what are the things that I'm looking for that say, okay, well, this isn't something that I should be treating. I need to send this person to an MD, or I need to send them to a cardiologist, or I need to send them to a neurologist. And so there's so much opportunity for physical therapists to be that first person to contact, especially because most, like from what we've seen, what we've seen in our practice and what I've seen as throughout the course of my short career at this point, it's only been 6 years, but a lot of people can come to us and we can treat it first time. And so there's a big thing in the United States, especially where physical therapy is mostly easily accessible in most of the 50 states, which is through what's called direct access. So if somebody gets an ankle sprain or gets hurt playing a sport, they can go right to a physical therapist, depending on the state. And in New York City and in New York State, you can see somebody for 10 visits or 30 days, whichever comes first. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that people come to, if they have questions, go see a physical therapist first.
Yeah. So when you said that a lot of the time you can actually fix someone in one session, can you talk us through that a bit? Because I was quite surprised when I first met you that you don't actually do a lot of manual therapy. I guess it depends a lot on the physio, but in my experience with physios, and I'd say the difference between you is that you don't actually use manual therapy unless it's absolutely needed. And I 100%. Sort of see where you're coming from there. And can you explain why that's the case? And then if that is the case, how could you possibly fix me in one session? Which you have actually done, so I can share my...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I want to take a step back and kind of I want to address the semantics in that statement. Like, I don't like to phrase it in the sense that we fix people, but we provide, because we're kind of going down this potential rabbit hole in terms of what we think happens at Match Fit Performance when we work with our athletes, and regarding manual therapy. So there's, between pet peeve and like the way that we want to treat, I think manual therapy is a very, very valuable tool to physical therapists and even like massage therapists and other healthcare practitioners that put their hands on people, because the power of touch is very important. But I think manual therapy gets overused in most cases, where it almost damages our clients' ability to be self-efficable. And we almost force our clients to become very dependent on us because they can't feel better without us having our hands on people. And so with a lot of our, with one of our pillars and our beliefs at Match Fit Performance, we really believe that if we're not making our athletes or our clients self-efficable, we're really doing ourselves a bad job, or we're doing the profession a disservice by making people dependent on us. And it almost sounds like I can probably almost hear the question in your head, and you're like, well, aren't you shooting yourself in the foot by making people self-efficable and not dependent on us. I think it's our duty as physios and even as healthcare professionals to make sure that people understand what's going on, and that we can, if manual therapy is something that's really needed to essentially change the pain experience, and we can talk about that in a second. I'll use manual therapy as an adjunct and then immediately follow that up with movement. And so when it comes to our approach to treatment, manual therapy is one of those stepping stones towards self-efficacy, as long as it's not the crutch that's used for people to need to feel better. And in most cases, like most of the people that come into us that are looking to get better aren't looking to get massages. They're looking to get back out onto the pitch, onto the court, or onto the weightlifting platform. So if we can give them those tools to calm down the pain experience, get them to move better, or continue to train in order to reach whatever goals they're reaching for, like that's a much more powerful tool than just, really, really depending on our hands to get a result, to get people to feel better.
That's interesting, Erwin. And you also seem to not use it because, can I say that potentially you can't actually change tissue in a session of manual therapy anyway?
Yeah. I would agree. I think, with the literature that I've seen and like what I've done, so I will readily admit that like when I got out of PT school, and especially with a lot of traditional physical therapists, there's such an emphasis on manual therapy as like a physical therapist's worth. And so I was one of those therapists until recently, like that I thought that I needed to be really, really good with my hands. And so there's a ton of literature that suggests that it takes a lot of force basically to deform tissue. And so one of the things that we're actually covering in our social media right now is almost essentially like physical therapy or healthcare myth busting. And so some of the studies that I found, it takes anywhere for upwards of 5,000 to 9,000 newtons of force to deform the iliotibial band. And so I'm sure you're familiar with the iliotibial band, and your listeners are. The iliotibial band is a very thick piece of connective tissue on the lateral thigh that basically connects the knee to the hip. And for those of you who haven't been in a cadaver lab, the ITB is almost an inch to an inch and a half thick, depending on the person that the ITB belongs to, and it takes a lot of force, and you can't cut it with a scalpel. And so to answer your question, like with manual therapy and some of the things that I see on a daily basis, especially on social media and even at the gyms that we work out of, like people are almost misguided to think that my hands are going to be able to deform your fascia or change your ITB or change the quality of your muscle. When overall, I think the long story short is we're changing neurological input. We're kind of playing mind games to decrease tone or change, what you're experiencing, the pain, and again, coming back to the pain experience.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that pain experience. And it's almost like, would you say, I don't want to undermine it so much, but it's almost like that this pain experience, and I put in inverted commas, it's really potentially a placebo effect.
Sure.
Would you say that, like, sometimes your clients might even get disappointed because they come to see you and you don't give them that placebo effect, so they feel like, hang on, I haven't been manipulated, so therefore I can't be better, I can't get better, and your role is to fix me.
Right.
And do you feel like you're, I guess, trying to educate more than I guess you'd hope?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's something that we talk with our colleagues with on almost a daily basis. And so, I think we do a really good job with our practice of either making sure that we're properly educating the clients that walk in the door, and have them understand, potentially what this pain experience is and what it means. And like on that conversation, I can basically understand either if somebody's kind of on board or if people are very, very skeptical. And so, with the people that are like on the borderline or very skeptical, sometimes I'll ask them to humor me. And with some of those clients, like I'll say like, hey, humor me. Like, I want you to just try this movement, whether or not it's like an isometric or even like some kind of weight bearing or loading, or even just like just this specific movement that I think might help reduce their pain experience. And then all of a sudden, this athlete that was super skeptical of me not even putting their hands on them when I have them retest the movements that they had come in for because they were feeling super uncomfortable, and all of a sudden the result has changed. Like they feel 50% better, 25% better, or they feel 100% better. All of a sudden their buy-in is like huge. They're like, wait, what did you do to me? And I'm like, I didn't even put my hands on you. And so there's, that's kind of what happens with a lot of the people that are on the edge. But some people, if I don't have the time to educate, I will use my hands, and we'll get an efficacible difference. And they'll say like, oh my gosh, you fixed me. But in most cases, it's like, we've given them the opportunity and their brain the opportunity to reduce the threat that the brain is experiencing, or even changing that pain experience.
Yeah, and I know you're quite researched in that area of the pain experience. And it's funny,
Sure.
we use the word experience because it's actually an experience, right?
100%.
So tell us more about the pain experience.
Yeah. And like you've heard this from me, and we've had this discussion over like a handful of times, or more than a handful of times. So at its base level, our brain has one job, and it's to make sure that it reduces the threat or keeps us safe at all costs. So between like making sure that we don't die, like we're not, putting our hands onto a burning stove, our brain learns very quickly. And so what it does is, what we experience as pain is essentially our brain trying to communicate with us. And so one of our big pet peeves at our practice, and even with some of our colleagues, is that our culture and society, and even the fitness and healthcare industry, have grown so accustomed to demonizing pain and the pain experience that most people will use just pain as a descriptor, which doesn't do us any good, right? So trying to get our athletes to understand what that experience feels like, because what might feel threatening, like spraining an ankle for one person, another person might be able to tolerate, even though they went through the same movements, right? So
basically you're talking about pain threshold then?
So not exactly. So sorry if that was misleading. I think there's so many. Our brain is basically trying to communicate with us through what we describe as pain, and so again, like the healthcare and fitness industries are so focused on like trying to get rid of this experience, as opposed to trying to understand what our brain is trying to tell us in terms of this communication. Because like what we found, treating clients, and even through the literature, is that just because we experience what most people might describe as pain, doesn't necessarily mean that there's tissue damage. So like lower back pain, for example, and again, like we're potentially opening a bag of worms here. So with people that experience lower back pain, which is like an epidemic, like in the United States, like I can't even remember the stat, but it's like a staggering amount of people that experience back pain on a daily basis. And so our brain will communicate to us like, okay, my back feels tight. But some people might not, might register that as pain. So what do? They try to mute that experience because one, it's scary, right? It's a sensation that doesn't feel normal, but it can be described as any way as like, and what we try to do with our clients and our athletes is get them to describe that in adjectives or descriptors. Is it sharp? Is it stabbing? Is it dull? Is it achy? Does it feel like pins and needles? Does it feel like burning? Because those sensations can give us as clinicians clues as to how to interpret what your brain is trying to tell you. And so this pain experience is it's so varied between individuals, like between pain threshold, or even like what most people would describe as pain threshold, or even like the potential like correlation between actual damage, which is very, very slim, especially with what we've seen anecdotally with our athletes and our clients.
So some people would say then that it's sort of in your head.
Some people might take that personally, and yes, they would say that, are you calling me crazy that it's in my head? Yeah, you're definitely not wrong.
Interesting. So I assume some of your clients would get a bit agitated or offended or upset about that discussion.
Some of them do. Some of our athletes like to make fun of us because they're like, oh, Erwin's just going to say it's in your head. And like there's a lot of upcoming literature, especially again with like pain science and even related to tendinopathy, or what most people will refer to as tendinitis. There's one very interesting study. I don't want to misattribute it. I think it's Jill Cook. She's a physiotherapist. I think she's a physio. She's a physio. Where they've basically mapped out some of these tendinopathies or tendinitis, with where these spots in the brain that light up relative to what when people experience pain. And so with these tendinopathy issues, most notably, like the elbow, I think it's the elbow, the patellar tendon, and other tendinopathies, like a lot of those parts of the brain that will light up that are related to the pain experience. Most of those areas are localized to the brain. But when we look at the tissue, there's nothing wrong with the tissue. So they've like done biopsies on these tendons, and there's nothing wrong with the tissue, but there's spots in the brain that are lighting up related to discomfort. There's only one tendon, I think, in the body, and it's the patellar tendon, where actual discomfort can come from the patellar tendon, and there's no correlation to spots in the brain where there's actual the pain correlation, and spots in the brain related to pain are lighting up relative to the patellar tendon, which is wild, and nobody knows why, and we can't figure out why. So in some cases, yeah, like I would argue that if there's anything that we can do to reduce threat in the brain, most of our athletes and clients will feel pretty good, usually after the first or even second session.
So what's an example where you'd reduce threat in the brain?
That's a great example. So manual therapy is potentially one of those adjunct interventions that we'll use. So either putting our hands on someone by, what some people would describe as like pin and stretch, or ART techniques. We love to use movement as an adjunct to treatment. So if there's, for example, somebody that's got lower back pain, maybe their lower back pain is really dedicated, what they're experiencing is lower back pain is basically really, really bad cramping in the lower back, because their brain is, feels threatened, and their lower back is cramping. It's tightened up. Their brain's sensing a threat. What we can do is basically work our client through spots of movement that don't feel threatened. So if it hurts to bend down and touch their toes, we're not going to have them bend down and touch their toes repeatedly. We're going to put them in a position where their brain might feel less threatened. So maybe they're on their hands and knees, or maybe they're on their back and they're actively bringing their knees up to their chest. So ways that we can get them to hip hinge and get their spine to flex and extend without setting off these pain alarms.
Interesting. And so basically you take them to the range of motion where they're actively comfortable and not feeling any pain.
Correct.
And then how does that progress from there?
So between those movements, and then there's also like a very big inquisition and questioning process that we go through. So for example, like if we're going to use this chronic lower back pain as an example, we need to ask questions like, what is your sleep and your recovery like? What are you dealing, what is your average day like? Because, and again, this is all anecdotal, but for a lot of people that we've seen with chronic lower back pain, it's not just, they're training CrossFit and they're back squatting very heavy. It happens that they are also they have a high stress life. So, between like sleeping 4 hours a night, like trying to manage 2 kids, working a job where, they move millions or billions of dollars each day. There's such a high level of neurological stress that, on top of their load management. So yeah, maybe this person with chronic lower back pain tried back squatting a 1 rep max for the 4th time this month. Like that could potentially have been the straw on, pardon the terrible pun, the straw that broke the weightlifter's back. And so, again, when it comes back to circle around to this pain experience, like there are so many external factors that contribute to what our brain outputs as this experience, in addition to trying to tell us, what feels safe and what doesn't feel safe.
Yeah, you've mentioned this a couple of times now about the loading. Can you tell us a bit more about progressive loading and what sort of, I guess, experiences you see in the clinic and how people can really be aware of that?
Yeah, so progressive load, and for the personal trainers out there and strength and conditioning coaches and fitness enthusiasts, there's a principle called the SAID principle. So specific adaptations to impose demands. So our body is so resilient that no matter what tissue, if we put a stress on that tissue is going to adapt, whether or not it's skin, it's, tendons, it's ligaments, it's bone. That tissue, if you apply the right amount of stress to it, that tissue is going to adapt to that stress, to adapt and be able to handle that higher level of stress. So, for the average person, it's, if you think of like a steel beam has a specific breaking point. So like you can put a specific amount of weight in the middle of this steel beam and it's going to collapse. But our bodies are so resilient that if you think of our bodies as a dynamic steel beam, we can put so much force that if we can put enough force on that steel beam that beam doesn't break, that beam becomes way stronger. So between like bone calluses, like calluses on your skin from doing pull-ups, on your hands from doing pull-ups, doing deadlifts, our bodies are resilient. And so with our athletes and this principle of gradual exposure and increasing load, being able to take somebody from, again, this person with lower back pain to gradually get them to start going back to lifting those, lifting the weights and doing the movements that they used to do, and continuing to move without setting off those alarms or even putting tissue at risk. Because again, like our bodies are super resilient. So, and they'll adapt to most anything as long as the tissue's not broken.
Mm. But how often do you get a client where, let's say, they haven't lifted for a while and they decide to get into weightlifting and they go from A to Z in a couple of weeks, and
Sure.
they've obviously just sort of gone a bit too crazy, a bit too soon? How often is that the case?
More, I think it depends. Like, so everybody used to hop on CrossFit and just, give CrossFit a ton of flack, mostly because, you know, the, it's a very unique sport where you're being asked to participate and push your red line all the time. And so, yeah, like with some of these weightlifters or even with some of these athletes, it's, you're consistently being asked to push it 100% all the time. And sometimes those athletes don't have a great handle on their body or don't understand, where their limits are at that point. Right. And so injury is just one part of that process in terms of the learning experience, trying to understand, like, how far can I push myself? Okay. Am I injured? Like, all right, well, that's my limit. I can come back to that limit, but I need to be able to grade that return to sport and make sure that my tissues, are healed and that I am able to handle that load consistently before trying to really push that red line, essentially.
Mm. Yeah. Erwin, I'd love to talk to you also about the relationship between personal trainers and physios. For me, as a personal trainer with no expertise in physiotherapy, I find it essential to work with a physiotherapist that I truly believe does an amazing job. Obviously, I've got to believe in that person, but in the best interest of my client, even if to the point where I could potentially lose the client because, for example, let's say, and I have many a time referred clients to you.
Yeah.
I could potentially lose them because you're a strength and conditioning coach and you could actually do that role potentially that I'm doing in the gym with them. But what's your experience and why should a personal trainer work with a physiotherapist?
I mean, exactly the reasons that you were just describing too, right? Between scope of practice and abilities. So, and your strengths, right? So, I think physical therapists and personal trainers should, if they're not already one and the same, they definitely, we can serve basically as a very, very powerful duo, especially with our clients. And when we approach this, especially with personal trainers or strength and conditioning coaches that want to refer to us, there are so many. The ultimate goal should be the shared mutual client, right? Because at the end of the day, if our client our shared client isn't able to do what they need to do, then we've done the client a disservice. And I think the reason why you and I and our practice and you rather have a really, really good relationship is because our mindsets are on the same wavelength. We're not focused on poaching from each other. We're really focused on our client, on our shared client. And so being able to operate off of this, abundance mindset, and overall, the better of the shared client, really pokes holes in a lot of this, oh, well, I'm worried about Erwin taking my client because, again, I think there's also the opportunity for really, really good personal trainers that also, advertise that they have skills in rehab, which for me is that's great. Even though some of them legally might not be able to do that, if they're offering a really, really good product and they're very good at what they do, I can't fault them. Because I think that what that makes what that makes all of us do is that makes all of us offer a better product. And then I have to be a better physio, and I have to be a better strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah,
And
I think you're right.
To add to that, sorry.
No, please add.
And to add to that, I think not everybody is going to jive with me. And, just because, so I think like there's always a good fit for somebody. And especially if somebody's referring to me, it's definitely not like, I want to make sure that we're all gaining, and that the client is gaining the most, because at the end of the day, it's all about the client.
Of course. And I think you've hit the nail on the head with that last comment there. But for me, it's slightly a selfish reason as well. I don't want to injure the client. And like to your point, I want to get the client as close to their goal as possible. So I'd be silly not to refer them to you, because obviously you're going to help them and help me help them with the best possible care that they can do. And so it's not a matter of, hey, they can't do training anymore, which leads me to my next question in a minute. But it's more to the point of how can they train more effectively without injury, and
exactly.
in actual fact more concentrated and sort of increasing the strength or the area that needs attention.
Yeah.
And that does lead me to my next question. So it's funny because sometimes it's almost this is almost like the same analogy of I'm too fat to go on a diet comment. People say I don't do yoga because I'm not flexible enough. I'm too fat to go on a diet. All of these analogies, but another common answer I get when I do refer people to physiotherapists is, oh no, I don't want to stop doing what I'm doing. And I'm like, well, obviously what you're doing is not working for you, but,
right.
But also it's that, the mindset of, I don't want to stop exercising, and the whole point, and I guess it depends on the therapist, but I know the way you work, it's not about stopping what you're doing. It's about what can you do with the current situation, and how can you move more or move without pain. And so I really wanted to highlight that, and maybe you could talk on that.
Yeah, I mean, so especially with some of the teams and the athletes that we work with. So for example, we run sports performance services for a professional ultimate Frisbee team. And so with those athletes that come to us, for example, with an ankle sprain or even a shoulder injury, our priority is, yes, to get them back to playing, right? So, notwithstanding if they're able to participate in practice, our job is to make sure that can they participate in practice adequately. So, and if they can't, what can we do to maintain their baseline so that they can continue to, maintain their conditioning? We can, keep them involved in sports or sport-specific activities so that they don't lose some of the tasks and skills that they need to do on a daily basis. So for example, an ankle sprain, if they can get onto a bike, or if they can go swimming to maintain cardio, we're going to write them a conditioning program. If they can't run around, we'll put them on a strength program for their lower extremity with things that won't aggravate the ankle. But on top of that, we'll also work in things into the programming so that they can continue to throw Frisbees, because they need to work on their touch. They need to get throws in. Very similarly, like, a CrossFit athlete that's got a shoulder injury, they need to be, if they want to continue to train, we'll sit down with them and look at or they'll text us and we'll figure out what their workouts are for the day. Okay, what can we do to scale that doesn't aggravate or piss off the shoulder? And then what can we do to maintain your conditioning base so that you don't drop off severely, so that you're not struggling when you come back to training regularly and once your shoulder's been good. So there's a lot that we emphasize with our athletes that just because you're injured means that you can't train. And most of it is all within reason too. Right. So, but cause I've heard from plenty of practitioners, like, people have come to us with back pain. I actually, saw somebody recently that came to me for the first time, and they said, they had some back pain issues, and they saw a surgeon, and the surgeon was like, you shouldn't be bending over and you shouldn't be deadlifting. But when I talked with this client about what they do on a daily basis in terms of like taking care of a house, I was like, I'm sure you've picked up a laundry basket and walked it over to the, you've walked it over to the washer dryer. And this person said, yes, so you had to bend over to pick up that basket, and they had to stop and think, and they're like, yes, I did. So it's like, there's a discrepancy here. So yeah.
That's awesome. Erwin, you mentioned at the start of our conversation that you're going to be doing some myth busting. I'd love to do some myth busting with you right here, just for a bit. I mean, maybe I'll kick it off and we can go from there. Can you bust this one for me? Because I hear it a lot. And in actual fact, I hear a lot of clients, people being told by their therapist that they need to learn to turn on their glutes because their glutes aren't turned on. And I'm thinking, if your glutes not turned on, you wouldn't be standing here talking to me. You'd be lying down on the ground.
100%.
So tell me a bit about this turning on of glutes.
Yeah. So I think that's really funny that you bring this up, because I actually had a discussion with somebody about this, and I was kind of delving to the bottom of this. The term gluteal amnesia was actually coined by a physical therapist by the name of Stuart McGill, who's a very, very well known and very renowned physical therapist, and
author too.
Yeah, and author, especially related to back pain. And so the term was coined by him because he had done a handful of studies, like individual studies, because related to gluteal activation in relation to lower back pain. And so what he had found with these individuals that were experiencing lower back pain, when he was looking at EMGs of their glutes weren't working. And so he had this hypothesis that there was this potential decreased neural drive from the brain to decrease the glutes in order to protect the lower back. And so I think, one, you hit the nail on the head, right? If anybody, even with lower back pain or discomfort, if your glutes weren't working, your glutes are one of the biggest muscles, like per square inch of your body. And if those muscles weren't working, you would probably dislocate your hip, or like you would just be on the floor. I 100% agree. But I think this gluteal amnesia term kind of got picked up and taken to an extreme in terms of these like hypotheses that, that these glutes forget how to work when you squat. And I'm not going to lie, I've propagated the myth, especially as a new clinician, where I've worked with CrossFit athletes that had lower back pain, and they were able to easily squat upwards of 200, 250, 300 pounds. And looking back on it, I wish I could, give myself a smack on the head and be like, think about what you just said to this athlete that is able to move a lot of weight. Because if their glutes didn't work or needed to be activated before they moved 200, 300 pounds, their spine would have collapsed. Like they would have collapsed under that weight, or they wouldn't be able to walk. So yeah, I definitely think that myth should be busted, and we need to be very, very specific and understand the semantics of the words we use, because what we found, especially in the pain experience and with a lot of pain science, what we say as healthcare providers and influencers and trainers and coaches really makes it sticks with people, and it can foster potential for uncertainty and even fear of these things.
And so, Erwin, what would you say is the correct term there, or, you know, in the case of, say, you know, the glutes not being turned on?
I wouldn't even. So I think when we talk about semantics, I think the use of the word activation implies that there's a deactivation, that these muscles are off. And I think, and I'm pretty sure Dr. McGill has come out and he's like, I think this term of, you know, glute amnesia has been taken to a maximum. So I try to stay away from utilizing terms like that where these muscles need to be activated, even in like warm-ups.
So what would you say then?
So I think if there's anything that we're trying to do, especially with glutes and related to lower back pain, is we're going to try and put some input into your spine and into your hips to change what your brain is feeling, which is almost like it's a very long roundabout way to explain it. But when we're properly educating our athletes, we're able to, we're able to kind of bridge that, and they're able to understand and kind of process that instead of just, quick to the point, like, oh yeah, your glutes are turned off.
I don't mean to go into this too much, but I see a lot of cyclists use their hip flexors a lot when they're cycling, and they get actually pain in their hip flexors. And the ones that really focus on trying to drive the force with their glutes tend not to get that same hip flexor pain.
Okay.
Is that a conscious? Can that be done consciously? I feel like it can be, and I feel like as a cyclist, I changed the way I would ride, and never feel that hip flexor pain, because I feel like I'm concentrating on using my glutes more. Is that total placebo?
I wouldn't say it's total placebo. So when to kind of answer that question with something we were talking about in terms of load management and gradual exposure, I think the hip flexor discomfort could potentially be obviously this person would need to go through a thorough evaluation, but with most cases of something like a potential overuse injury or even an acute injury, being able to account for, how often this person is cycling, what their volume cycling is, and even, is this cyclist somebody that cycles, maybe 1 to 2 times a week, but they're riding, upwards of 20 to 50 miles between 2 rides, and it's someone that they're potentially spiking their load versus somebody that's kind of a very avid cycler and that's experiencing this hip flexor discomfort. Is it maybe more of a strength issue, or yes, is it even more of still an overuse issue? So are there ways that we can address the load management there, or even address the acute strength of the hip flexor to change what you're experiencing? So I don't disagree. It might not be placebo, but you still need to use your hip flexors in that drive, right? Especially because cycling is very similar to running. You need to be able to, as one leg drives towards the ground, the other foot is cycling up. So using your hip flexor there is very important.
Interesting. So there's my myth anyway. Can you bust one for me that you hear all the time?
We talked about it a little bit earlier. With deforming fascia and changing muscle. Actually, you know what? I'll take this another way. I had it and it slipped away from me.
That's all right. We'll come back to that one. Tell us another one.
Tightness. People ask me about tightness all the time. And so especially with what most people perceive as tightness, what I've seen anecdotally is that if we can put input into the joint that's closest to the muscle that's tight, we can almost alleviate or change that tightness. So for example, a lot of people love to complain about tight hamstrings because they can't touch their toes. But all of a sudden, for some people, if they can't reach down and touch their toes in standing, if we put them on the floor and they can reach and touch their toes in a pike position with their feet out and their knees straight in front of them, we might be able to, I might sit with that person and say, it's not a hamstring tightness issue, it's a core stability issue, because your brain doesn't feel safe letting you get down into this position. But when we take gravity out of the equation, all of a sudden, and you're sitting on the ground, all of a sudden your brain's like, oh, I can do this. Like, this is easy.
And to take that to a further point, if you get them in surgery and the surgeon puts them under anesthesia and then takes their leg, I guarantee you that they can put them in the splits.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, for sure.
So it's potentially the brain stopping them from moving.
Yeah, it's usually the end game. The beginning and the end game is usually the brain, because if the brain doesn't want anything to happen, it's sure as hell not going to let it happen.
And would you say too that, back on that tightness issue, that often when someone's actually tight, it's not that they're tight, it's actually that they're slightly weak?
Yeah, it's usually what we've found anecdotally is that there's a strength issue.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
I'm just like, they're weak, but yeah, sorry, I should have said strength issue. I like how you form that. So what about another one that I like to hear is short and long muscles. Oh, I've got short. I can't sort of touch my toes because I've got short hamstrings. I guess it's the same sort of thing as tight.
Sorry, say that one more time.
The short and long. So like some people will say, oh, I can't reach my toes because I've got short hamstrings.
Short muscles, yeah. I think, again, like that really has, so, I mean, it's different for some people, right? Because I think the best analogy that I love to use is especially with yogis or even gymnasts that have come into our clinic or come in to work with us, and they come in, they're like, I've got lower back pain. Okay. And then, when I look at their lumbar, or when I ask them to do a lumbar screen, which is basically, we're looking for red flags related to the spine. They'll reach down, they'll put their palms on the floor, and they're like, oh, I just feel really, really tight. So I think it's, again, like the best answer that I can give to that is, hamstring length is really, really subjective. And I think a lot of it really has to do with neurological input or output and what the brain is going to allow to happen.
Interesting. Bust another one for me.
Oof. So after working this recent Frisbee tournament, we had a lot of athletes come to us that would want, strapping or ankle tape, or even like taping up their hamstrings, or taping up their shoulder with kinesio tape. One, I think, a lot of people feel stable when we put stretchy tape on their shoulders, and their shoulder is still allowed to move. And so there's actually, I don't know if you heard about this, but there's actually a class action lawsuit against rock tape, for people are upset because they feel like rock tape is not giving accurate, or they've been making false claims regarding their product. But I don't necessarily think that this stretchy, sticky tape is providing more input, or this, this ankle tape is going to provide stability into your, that keeps your ankle from moving around. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're changing what the brain feels through the ankle, because, this flimsy, stretchy piece of tape or this strapping that we put around the ankle is not going to prevent your tissues from being damaged. Like, it's not going to prevent an ankle sprain. It's not going to prevent your shoulder from dislocating.
So I get your point there.
Yeah.
But knowing that the brain is doing that, would you tape it anyway?
Sometimes there's an amazing placebo effect from taping ankles and taping shoulders. Yeah. So depending on the context, depending on the time that I have to educate this person in front of me, and even with like full awareness, I'll try and give as much information as possible. But sometimes people can't be bothered. They're like, "Yeah, I know it doesn't do anything, but it makes me feel better." Okay, great. I'll tape you. Sure.
Yeah,
It's your shoulder.
I love your approach to that. It's like, yep, if that's going to make you feel better, then we'll do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Thanks.
Great. Look, I know there's probably a thousand other myths that we could go through, but
Totally.
But they're great. And look, before I let you go, Erwin, I guess I'd like to ask you, can you share with our listeners maybe just one piece of advice in relation to physiotherapy, anything at all that you think would be valuable?
Yes. And this is basically one of the cornerstones of our practice. Anybody can give you a very, very good strength and conditioning program or a training program, but if you're not spending the time recovering, that training program is absolutely fucking worthless. Pardon my French. Because
I'd argue firstly that not anyone can give you a good strength and conditioning program, but
sure.
But I do agree with the latter part of your statement.
Yeah.
Can you give us perhaps an example of someone that you've worked with where that's been the case? I know you've worked with a lot of professional teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, when a lot of our athletes that don't play at a professional level. Actually, I was gonna single out ultimate Frisbee, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think especially with athletes that come into our clinic that are just very, very passionate about their sport, and looking to continually train and grow, is something that's amazing. But sometimes it's almost a double-edged sword, because these athletes basically will feel like they're missing out if they're not training 6 or 7 days a week. And so again, to like kind of clarify my statement is, a lot of athletes want to feel like they're training like a professional athlete, but we don't realize that a lot of these professional athletes that perform at such a high level, only train for maybe 1 to 2 hours per session, maximum twice a day, but they don't have to go to work a 9 to 5 or even like a 10 or a 12-hour job.
So essentially their stress load is only during their training versus everything else that a normal person's got to deal with. Exactly.
So, LeBron James will go to practice in the morning, go home and he'll eat breakfast, go train, come home, play with his kids, take a nap, lay out by the pool, and then go back to work, later that afternoon, versus, the average person that works in finance or, works a desk job. There are so many other extensive stressors, and those, again, like professional athletes have the time to recover, but, the average person doesn't make that time to recover. They're not investing in their recovery.
Excellent. I'm glad you ended on that point. That's awesome.
Thank you.
One last question for you, Erwin. We ask all the guests on the show. Do you have a tattoo?
Oh, I don't. I've been thinking about getting one. I'm just very fickle. But no, I don't.
If you got one, what would you get?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about getting our crest, a little backstory behind the crest and our logo. Our logo is shaped like a football club logo. And so the crest that outlines the monogram is actually the New York City crest, because my business partner and girlfriend and I are from the tri-state area. She's from New Jersey, but she's, wanted to be in New York for forever. And I was born and raised in the Bronx and grew up in Westchester, and New York. I'm New York born and raised. And so that was a huge influence. So I want a crest, like a small one, maybe on my forearm on the underside.
Awesome. I'll keep my eye out and see what happens.
Yeah.
Look, Erwin, thank you so much. We're going to look out for your social media myth busting that you do as well, because I'm really intrigued to find out some more myths that you can bust.
Yeah, we've got one coming out tonight, so keep an eye out.
Excellent. We'll link to that and your website and everything else in the show notes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.